Okay, so we're going to continue talking about market research, and particularly in support of marketing that we started the other day when we talked about surveys and telling stories through data. We're going to look at more at how this is really applied to marketing and look at a broader view of how research is done beyond just survey research. For a reason that may or may not be obvious, companies need to collect data if they're going to be customer-centered all the time. They need to, first of all, to collect data to find out what customers need. They need to collect data about what their competitors are doing. And they have to collect data about what's happening in the world, the environment that's affecting, let's say, their marketing campaigns. So we're going to go and look at some ways to do this, and particularly about the idea of a marketing information system. Not just how this data is collected, but how this data is held, and then how it is used to make marketing decisions. And we're going to go through some examples that some companies use to collect more information and to provide better information to understand how customers are using their product, what are their real needs, and what are how to use them for business decision making. So instead of just looking at this as that what we're looking for are what we call customer insights. So it's not just things that are true, but you might say things that are fresh, things that are maybe counterintuitive. If you remember the MAGIC criteria that I used in the last lecture, interestingness is one of the most important things to do when you're looking for whether the data is useful or not. Is that it tells us something that we didn't know before, something that maybe is counterintuitive to our expectations. And then it's an insight that we use to then serve the customer and to build more customer value. Perhaps this is modifying the product or modifying how the appeal is or linking it up to something that the customer cares about and therefore creating more value for the customer. So one example of this would be Tide. And what the Tide did is not so much survey research, but something more akin to anthropological research, or you might call participant observation, where they did an ethnography of how people actually use their products. So they went in and observed particularly women in households and how they were using Tide. And their insight that they gleaned from this was that women have strong emotional ties to their clothing, which means the idea of from a man, a t-shirt might be a t-shirt, or a set of pair of jeans is a pair of jeans. The difference between different qualities of fabric, being sensitive to different types of cleaning agents, was more important to them. And therefore, what they did is they, in a sense, built their entire marketing campaign about kind of, let's say, that they know the details of the fabric. It's not just that they're clean or they're efficient or they are saving time, but in the sense that there are many different types of Tide because there are many different types of fabrics and clothing that are being cleaned. And so what's happening is that instead of just doing traditional market research, it means doing surveys out there and saying, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you like my product? Or asking them whether they use the product or how aware they are. What they're kind of being made into what are called customer insight teams, which means they're trying to find ways that products are being used, which are not necessarily what the product is intended to be and whether they're buying the product or whether they like the price of the product, but in a sense how people are using the product maybe in new and interesting ways beyond their original use. A good example that I don't have a slide on, but it would be kind of duct tape. Duct tape has been used to do almost everything, hold things together. But what you've seen in the last few years is that you have a lot of designer duct tape. So people don't just like duct tape to hold things together. They like it for almost the artistic or for, let's say, the personalized aspect of that. And so what you've seen is duct tape, which I believe is a 3M product, being more individualized and being, kind of say, more artistic rather than just kind of the standard black or gray duct tape that you might have seen. And these insights don't just have to come from quantitative research. They can come from just like what associations doing focus groups with customers about how they're reacting to or how they're using their product. So another kind of, let's say, example of this is how Apple gave the insight that the iPod, that people wanted to have a lot of music, but they also wanted something that wasn't big. So as a child of the 1980s, what we had back then were things called boom boxes, which were large cassette tape things with speakers on them that would be kind of like you would carry down your shoulder and it'd be large and heavy. Or even, let's say, the Sony Walkman that came out later, it was relatively large. And so what people wanted is small things that people could listen to music, but other people didn't know that they were listening to music. So something that you could put into a pocket or clip onto your arm for workouts or running through things. And now the Sony Walkman or the boom boxes really don't exist anymore, except maybe as antiques or novelty items. 75% of the market is that people listen to music on something that looks like this, an iPod, just small enough to hold the digital musical content, and not even with the, let's say, the headphone jack anymore. Apple has basically made it so that, and I'm sure every one of you understand this, is that the idea that it's hidden is one of the big advantages of like a lot of Apple's products. And this is kind of different because Apple very much went into design as part of, let's say, their product, which means the idea of the rounded edges and the rounded rectangle as being kind of definitively an Apple product, like whether it's their tablets or their phones. But the idea that they're designing something that is not to be seen and therefore design doesn't matter so much. Another one way to gather, let's say, customer insights is Del Monte used kind of a social network called I Love My Dog. And the idea is that people would put up images of them interacting with their animals, which would kind of show like the diversity of how people interact instead of having a general model that a pet does a certain thing, that they have a lot of different insights into this. And I think in a previous lecture I talked about I once went to go see a question and answer session with the musician Billy Joel, and he talked about how musicians were using the first synthesizers back in the early 1970s. And a synthesizer was designed to create kind of orchestral music, the ability to create a whole variety of different instrument sounds without actually having the players for that or having a studio audience, a studio orchestra to produce the music. And so there was this big, let's say, guidebook about how to create all the different sounds of existing instruments. But what Billy Joel was saying is that that's not actually how musicians did that. Instead of, let's say, reading the book and saying, well, this is how a flute sounds and this is a violin, what they did is they basically started mashing on the keys to see how this machine would create new sounds that they didn't have before. And so the synthesizer sound that typifies the late 70s, early 80s music really is musicians interacting with the product in a way that wasn't intended by the original design of the product. And how do you gain that is by having people share their experiences and seeing how they're using things. And very often these are things that people are not, let's say, the original product design of the product function. So what you put this into is something called a marketing information system, and you might see this as an acronym, MIS for short. And this is a procedure of, let's say, gathering information, storing the information, and making it usable to do different types of analysis on the information. So whether it's spatially organized or organized by different demographic criteria, and therefore something that decision makers can use, which means not just simply having a survey or having a research to answer a particular question, but having a lot of information there so that when the question comes up, they can go into the data and then ask, like, what are the cross tabulation, which means are younger or older customers more using our product? Are they using our product? What are the different wealth categories? And so going beyond just simple like demographic cuts on it, an ability to answer, let's say, specific questions, and having that to use that to make actionable like business decisions for your product or your firm. So what generally happens is that most companies have what's proprietary data. They know who they're selling to, and therefore they know, let's say, kind of who their captured market or the customers are. And so they might have internal databases, usually now it would be digital or electronic, about how the company is using it. So for example, you're collecting data on where you're selling your products, to who you're selling your products, whether your products are selling at a certain price or not. If you have, let's say, one of those like discount cards that you scan at a grocery store or at a pharmacy, every single time you make a purchase, they're linking your profile, meaning your name, your address, and other basic general demographic categories about you with the types of purchases you're making. And so what they're able to do is see how satisfied you are. And you might see this also in terms of things where you get, on your receipt at different stores. Let's say if you fill out the survey, you'll get a coupon for some item on your next trip. And what they're doing is they're collecting, let's say, how happy you are, with their product. And you see also things on Amazon or online retailers. You're seeing where people giving 1 to 5 stars on different products of their experience. And this allows them to, first of all, to try to change an unhappy customer to a happy customer, but to glean data on on what people are reactions, whether they like the product in general, but maybe they found it flimsy or overpriced. One thing like I see very often, like one place that I shop on Home Depot, I see a lot of images of people using their products or showing their installation or their finished product, and that might once again give the company information on how are people using our product. And they're able to generate this information internally just by the process of collecting sales data. Um, so one of the things I do is I volunteer as an EMS driver, and they keep data on, for example, like every single thing. So every single time someone goes to the hospital, they have to write up a report, and they can keep track things like how often they're following standard procedures. Now, in emergency medicine, sometimes it's not that you cut corners, it's that some things will take priority, like getting the person to the hospital as quickly as you can. But the question is whether they follow the procedures. Like, do they give this type of, do they check for this when they had a certain symptoms? And then they'll, let's say, collect that data and they'll try to improve best practices, not just for one ambulance corps, but for emergency medicine in general. So another thing that Barney's, which is a retailer in New York City, is that you can look how people are browsing the websites. And I've mentioned this many times in class, so they can track, how long your cursor hovers over certain things, what pages you go to, what you clicked on, but also the movement of your cursor over the screen. So even if you didn't click on something, and very often people think like they're just they're browsing over it, as you move the cursor over different areas of the screen, they're following your interest. And very often people do this where they track your eyes and where your eyes are on the screen to draw your eyes to particular things. And then they understand like, oh, you're interested in something, not because you made a purchase or not because you investigated further, but because something made you stop and think. And so Barney's is something that gains insights by analyzing online behavior where people are more likely to be honest, or at least not covering up. So when people take surveys, as we talked the other day, is that sometimes people lie on surveys. But when people are browsing, they kind of treat it as something that's happening in private, and therefore you can glean more information by how people are interacting with online websites. And because people are able to collect data on their own websites, they might have some proprietary information that is not shared with the public or the business community at large. So the second thing that you might want to collect data on is what customers and competitors are doing in the marketing environment. So, for example, you might see like you can look at other ads. You can look at what becomes viral. You can look at what your competitors are doing in the digital environment or in the marketing environment. And so you might track things like not simply about your products, but maybe more about the industry at the whole. And you can see like, are you winning or losing market share? Are you getting more recognition than than your competitors? So there are some like general things. One of them is called Radian, which will kind of track customer conversations, which means that they will look to see how often customers are using certain words. So, like for example, I can look for brand names or company names and how often they're mentioned. And so, let's say you are tracking like people's consideration of different products or different firms, or what they can see is how often they're mentioned, what words they're mentioning with them, and what associations they're doing. So Radian basically looks on social media. So when people put things on their Facebook wall or people tweet things out, they can see how often, let's say, my company is being mentioned, or how often they're using certain words with certain products. And then you can analyze the overall trends and see if there's a pattern that might be useful to you. And very often you can see this with like news stories where some word enters into the lexicon and then becomes kind of a buzzword. So I think one of the things that you'll probably find out later is that early on people refer to it as a coronavirus. I find more and more people are using COVID-19 to refer to it, maybe because it's a more technical term. And as people became more aware of it, they started using more technical terms than the general term of a coronavirus, which is not just this particular virus we're dealing with right now. So we're going to look more about different ways of doing market research. And I think that you can look at research as anything that's systematic, which means anything that is done with a purpose, that is designed that you collect information, and information doesn't just mean quantitative information like numbers or survey responses, but any type of information that might be helpful in a structured, systematic way. So you can either have internal firms where you do the marketing as part like a bureau within your existing bureaucracy, or you can hire outside specialists who you might task to with a certain mission to say, I would like to know more about a certain thing, about how people are using our product, and then have them deliver a report to your marketing department. So there are different types of research. Exploratory research, descriptive research, and causal research. I'm going to take this from the last to the front. Causal research is basically looking at cause and effect. When something happens, does it lead to something else? So when people buy my product, are they likely to use it with something, buy another product? Or, for example, when the economy goes down, do people buy more or less of my product, or do more searches of my product? Which means is that you're looking for a relationship that's more than just a correlation or a description of the situation. So, for example, you're trying to see why people. You're trying to answer the question of why people are doing something, or why there's a connection between two things when you're doing causal research. When you're doing descriptive research, what you're mostly doing is you're trying to get numbers. You're trying to get an overall snapshot, mostly to give context. So, for example, you might want to know how many teenagers live in a particular community. You might want to know how wealthy a particular community is. And a lot of this research, can glean from, like, say, census research or things on home ownership, things on structure of the different households, and also descriptive things like how many units did you sell, what price do they sell at, and this is mostly to kind of describe something, to paint a picture of, like, well, what's the American public look like? Is it older? Is it younger? Is it wealthier? Where do they live? Are they moving? Things of that sort. That doesn't really answer any specific question, but kind of gives you a better lay of the land. And finally, there are exploratory research, which means that you don't really know what the question is. You're kind of in the blind, and you're trying to make kind of a first cut at something. So an exploratory research might be something like, I went out and I talked to some people. I talked to some customers, or I sat people down for a focus group and just had them talk about my product. Now, this might be anecdotal. It might not be determinative. It might not be statistically significant. But it can be suggestive, and it suggests things you might want to investigate. So, for example, if people have a negative reaction, you might ask them to explain, like, why don't you like this product? And in their process of explaining that, even though it's just a single person's opinion, they might suggest some type of associations that people are making, and you might want to do further research to kind of understand why do they have these associations, and how many people would have these associations. Okay, when you're doing market research, you probably generally need to know before you do the research, like, what exactly are you looking for? If you don't know what your questions are, you tend to get a lot of bad information, or it's not structured in certain ways. So, for example, this is like designing a test. When you design a test, you're not just throwing questions out there and hopefully they get a certain percentage correct. You want to know whether they know about particular things. And so very often you have like a testing plan, which means I want to test so many questions on this topic, so many questions on that topic, and see what information, whether they have a broad sense of the overall information. Then you need to have a plan, which means I'm going to sample from this target population. I'm going to conduct a survey or experimental research, and then usually you're going to present kind of a written report suggesting what the plan is to management so they can okay and allocate the money to conduct the research. So part of what a plan might include is what information is already out there. Like, do we have to do new research? Maybe the research already exists. It's always cheaper to use publicly available data, which might not be perfect, but good enough to answer the question that you have. Or there's people who are collecting data, as their primary business, and they might be willing to sell their results or their inside information to you to help you, rather than having you conduct, sui generis research. You might decide how you're going to do the research, how you're going to contact your customers, how, we talked about this last time, how you sample, and what instruments? Are you going to do surveys or focus groups? Are you going to do experiments, or are you going to do word associations? Are you going to do online behavior tracking, or are you going to look at census collected data? So different types of data. So the most commonly used data is secondary data, mostly because the secondary data is being collected all the time by various different government agencies, different businesses, and it's information that already exists somewhere else and maybe for a different purpose. Like the census is supposed to collect information mostly for determining how many people different places, so they can use it for allocations of government policies, but also to determine the representation from different states. Now, in the process of doing that, they collect a lot of economic data, the number of businesses, incomes in different areas, how many people live in different households, what's the nature of the household, and things of that sort. So you might be collecting your internal database on sales data. There might be, let's say, businesses that collect data like credit reporting agencies that collect data all the time, or banks that collect the data all the time on economic matters. Or they can be just government sources like the census, like the Small Business Bureau. And for some things, you might be collecting data like on the EPA about water quality and things of that sort, which might not be to answer your specific question, but it can be very interesting information. And social scientists particularly are very good at trying to find information to collect on things because they don't have enough money to do the research exactly what they want, so they find indirect ways of collecting the information. So my background is doing research on the Japanese police, and I would read lots and lots of data that the police collected, which was not very useful if you wanted to understand the police, but it was very useful if you wanted to understand other things about society, because the police collected information on public meetings and number of crimes and what types of businesses existed in different precincts. And so I had a friend who was doing research on the recovery from the 1924 Tokyo earthquake, and I told them, so like the police were collecting this information about, how many different groups were meeting in different parts of Tokyo, and he used that to do a before and after to see how different parts of the city recovered from the earthquake. And he was trying to look at whether it was more about social connectedness explained why they recovered rather than the amount of damage that the earthquake did. And that was a source of information. So instead of having to do the research, which is impossible in history, he was able to use information the police were collecting to answer a lot of his questions. So I mentioned one of the businesses, Experian, which is somewhat developed is a credit rating agency. But what they do is they collect a lot of information about purchases, like when you use your credit card, whether you're paying your bills on time. And they give a lot of information about customers. They can give a lot of information about what products people are buying. And they can give information about, other types of information that people are giving. So, what are they buying? What types of things are they signing up for online? Free accounts, so they use Google more than they use Amazon, things of that sort. So Experian mostly is a credit rating agency, but by collecting all this data on the economy, they can also then sell this data. You're seeing that a lot of free social media platforms are also doing this. This means they're not charging their users any money to use like Facebook or Google Docs or things of that sort, but what they're doing is they're getting a lot of information about how society is running and then being able to sell that information to people who have money who want to know more about people using their products. Some other types of things on the internet in addition to Experian, ComScore.com, how people are using different websites, ClickZ about e-commerce, what kinds of ads and how many clicks they're getting, Forrester about web traffic on different sites, so they can see like if you were looking like where you want to put your information. For example, you might, depending on your product, you might want to put it. You don't want to put it randomly on just internet sites, but you might want to put it on sites that the type of customer you're looking for are more likely to go to, whether they're wealthier customers or whether they're customers that are interested in sports or fashion or different types of things. They might have different, let's say, online patterns, and therefore, if you're doing a digital online ad, you might want to put it in a particular place where people are seeing it, or frankly, even put it into certain people's friendship networks. That was something that was done with Facebook particularly. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of secondary data? The advantage is that it's cheap and it's quickly available because it already exists, and because it already exists, It's a fraction of the cost of something you would have to develop on your own. And it can, because let's say some of these data collecting organizations are much larger, like the census or government agencies. If you're a small business, you're not going to be able to conduct, detailed market research. However, you can go to the census and learn a lot about your community and figure out whether it's a good place to locate a small business. Like you can look for, and we did this with our business plans. Like if I'm starting a pizzeria, I can find out how many other pizzerias are in the area, and whether it's a saturated market, meaning that there's not going to be a lot of demand for an additional pizzeria. And I could also even look at like how much money different types of businesses are making. So for example, maybe there's a lot of pizzerias, but they're all very profitable. I might say, well, there's business to be cut into. Like people like business pizza in this area, and they're more likely to buy it if there's another store, another thing. Disadvantage is that you have to take with what you get. So the question you're looking for, something that's very like precise, might not be available in the secondary data. And very often, because you didn't collect the data, you might not understand the accuracy of the data, how well it was conducted, whether the sample was as good as they say it was, and how impartial the data is. So generally, government data is pretty objective because not because the government is necessarily honest, but because a lot of this is conducted by things like the Labor Department or the Commerce Department. And because businesses want good data, they generally lobby these there might be a lot of bias or favoritism for some government programs, but generally everyone wants good data, and you find that those are the most professional, and sometimes the most insulated from outside pressures in some of these departments. We've had some, and that's why some people are so angry about the census being manipulated, is because it might affect the quality of data they're getting, and people rely upon the quality of that. So primary data is kind of things that you directly collect yourself. So things that you either from direct insight or direct observation, or that you collect original research, and as a result you can frame your questions better, and you can be more targeted in looking for the things that you want answered. The hope is that primary data is more relevant, that it's more accurate, probably more timely, meaning reflecting current developments as opposed to things that are more historical and unbiased, hopefully. So the first type of research might be observational research, and this is the gathering, just what's called participant observation, and this kind of is like anthropological research, where you put yourself into a marketing environment or a business environment or a customer environment, and you just make observations like, it seems that people are drinking a lot of coffee, or people tend to be buying scones when they're drinking coffee. You can't, let's say, all you're doing is observing their behavior. You can't necessarily see into their head. And so very often you have to infer what they're thinking from what they're doing. And because sometimes there's a mismatch between behavior and thought, this can lead to over-interpreting or overgeneralizations. So it would not be good for things that survey research might be better at, about attitudes and feelings and motivations, and all you're looking at is behavior. But ethnographic research, you can see things in context. It's like saying that if I watch someone do something versus giving them a test, the test might be an unnatural habitat, and people might perform better or worse than their real skills. But if I watch someone actually do something, like if I'm watching an auto mechanic take a test on car engines versus actually watch them fix an engine, I might have a different understanding about what they're doing, what their process is, and how well they understand the information. And so sometimes this leads to less breadth but better depth of information, a richer understanding of the consumer. So survey research, survey research is basically applying to society what teachers do in classrooms with tests. If I asked you, let's say, 20 multiple choice questions, that's a survey. I'm surveying what the knowledge is among students in the room. And that generally gives me a lot of good information about overall is the class getting the information, but might be very bad at telling me what the actual understanding is by individual students. Because there's also usually a lot of random noise. We talked about how some people, when they do survey questions, particularly attitudinal questions, tend to give bad information. Because like students taking tests, they try to figure out I know what's right. It's not so much what's right, it's what's in the teacher's head. and very often students will give the answer not that they believe to be correct, but what they think the teacher thinks is correct. And sometimes that can lead to second guessing or to things like, well, the last 5 questions have been letter A, so the next answer can't be letter A because they wouldn't have 5 or 6 like in a row of the same choice. And things that are not actually related to understanding the information, but people trying to, game the test. And so survey research has these problems, but it's also relatively easy because it's easy to write a set of questions with, let's say, closed answers, because then you limit what people can respond, and therefore you know what form the data is going to be, and it's easier then to use that data for the next step of analyzing it. While if you just write, let's say, long kind of essays or descriptions, you might have a lot of detail and a lot of richness to it, but it might be hard to get that into a way you can analyze it. So experimental research is generally best for understanding causal effects. Like I can, so an example of a causal research is that I might say, here are like a taste test. Here are 2 products. Which one do you like better? And I can basically, by using experimental controls, by matching people in different groups, giving them different treatments, using different messaging. Like, so I can have a product and then use different word associations with that and see which ones are they more likely to buy. I can more get into what's the cause and effect relationship. Like, they liked my product with this celebrity more than that celebrity. Or if I made up very often, what you see in political research is they'll say, when they're asking about the president, they might create a scenario which is really about a governor of a state and ask how people would respond if they found out certain information. And what they're doing is trying to find out how people react to a new policy or to a news story that might come out that's adverse to their candidate. So what a lot of this goes into is ultimately customer relationship management. If I know more about customers, I can satisfy my customers more, create more value for them. And if you remember our original definition of marketing about serving customers' needs more than just buying and selling a product, they're going to get more value, and then you're going to be able to maximize customer loyalty with your product. So you use things like, the loyalty cards that I mentioned before, is that they're data mining a lot of the information. So every single time you purchase something on his card, and Kroger is a grocery store, you can send people, mailers or 3% back if they answer a survey. And what's happening is you're getting them to, I see this very often with CVS, where the type of coupons you get are based upon things you already purchased linked to that card in your previous purchases. And they might give you a certain percentage more. So there's more targeted, that they're not sending coupons to everyone, but they're sending coupons to particular people who buy particular things, or people who might need a little more incentive to buy something. So something you bought infrequently, but maybe if you had a coupon or a discount on it, you might buy it more. You can figure out whether people are you can tip them over from being a non-buyer to a buyer of your product. So what are some of the benefits of customer relationship management? First of all is that, it's kind of saying that when customers get if I can predict what customers want and put it in front of them, then they're going to be happy with their product. And it's going to be from very invasive, where by tracking your phone, they know that when you pass by a product in a store that you like, they can send you a push alert saying, by the way, you can get 20% off this product. And very often you see this with Amazon and online retailing, is that they'll make suggestions like, people who bought this product that you're looking at right now also looked at this or also bought this product. This kind of helps your search for the thing you're looking for. And I know a lot of people who look on Amazon in general, having a vague idea of what they want and being able to target it by kind of the suggestions that Amazon will give, because they're looking at what people did previously when they were looking at different products. And this is a more targeted way of approaching your customers than a broadcast message, meaning you put an ad out there, everyone sees it, and people react differentially to it. And this allows you also to link secondary products. So like, for example, we talked about Pepsi earlier this year, that when you buy a Pepsi beverage, maybe you're going to buy a Pepsi snack. And so you'll be able to cross-sell products, and therefore, if people drink this beverage with this type of snack, you'll have better